Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on one of the most compelling and, frankly, terrifying deep dives we've ever done. The life and reign of King David.
That's right.
We've synthesized a ton of source material, and we're focusing entirely on the narrative laid out in 2 Samuel.
And our mission today is really to trace David's phenomenal ascent, the political maneuvering, the divine endorsement that led to the unification of a really fractured Israel.
And then we pivot.
Then we pivot to analyzing the devastating self-inflicted wounds that resulted in, the catastrophic collapse of his own family. We're extracting these critical nuggets about leadership, spiritual integrity, and that unrelenting tension between divine forgiveness and the hard reality of earthly discipline.
Exactly. We're looking at a crucial transition from Saul's failed monarchy to David's. We want to see how this anointed king, this man handpicked by God, navigated a civil war, established a dynasty, and yet fundamentally failed.
And in the most personal and critical arena of all,
his own household. You're going to see how public success masked this deep private decay, and the fallout is it's genuinely shocking.
It really is.
So let's unpack this, starting at the absolute beginning of 2 Samuel, which is, of course, the death of Saul. It's a moment that should have been pure relief for David.
It should have been.
Yet the narrative opens with what seems like a self-inflicted wound for an ambitious young man.
It's an astounding opening scene, and it really sets the tone for the complex politics of David's early reign. You have this Amalekite young man. He rushes to David in Ziklag, and he's bearing news of Saul's death.
Right.
But the account he delivers, claiming he was the one who slew Saul, it stands in direct contradiction to what we know from 1 Samuel 31.
Which clearly states Saul took his own life.
Exactly. He fell on his own sword after being gravely wounded.
So he's just fabricating the story. He saw an opportunity to get ahead by presenting a politically convenient lie.
Precisely. This young man had likely stumbled across the battlefield, found Saul's corpse, and just stripped the dead king of his royal emblems.
The crown and the royal bracelet.
Right. And he assumes that David, Saul's longtime enemy and rival for the throne, would just rejoice that his great obstacle had been removed. He's expecting a reward.
He's the bearer of good news.
It was a classic self-serving fabrication driven by, pure political opportunism.
But the calculation didn't just backfire. It led to the Amalekites' immediate execution.
It blew up in his face spectacularly.
So why did David, who had just been relentlessly pursued by Saul, choose to execute the one claiming credit for the death?
Because David believed his story. And the young man, by his own proud admission, had participated in the death of the Lord's anointed. And that act sets the political and the spiritual tone for David's entire reign. David immediately condemned him, saying, "Your blood is on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you."
Wow.
This was a necessary, really harsh display of David's core operating principle, respecting the institution of Yahweh's anointed leadership.
Even when the leader himself, Saul, was corrupt and tyrannical.
Especially then. By punishing the Amalekite, David signaled to all of Saul's loyalists that he was not some vengeful opportunist. He was the legitimate successor who respected divine law.
And that sets up this beautiful, deep layer of irony when you connect it back to the history of the Amalekites themselves.
Oh, the irony is so rich, and you can tell it's deliberate. The Amalekites were notorious, nomadic enemies, sort of the ancient boogeyman, constantly raiding Israelite cities.
And David had just come back from fighting them.
He had just returned from slaughtering a portion of them. But the real depth comes from Saul himself. God had specifically commanded Saul years earlier to annihilate all the Amalekites.
A command Saul famously and, fatally disobeyed.
Right. He spared their king and their best livestock, and now one of the people Saul spared is claiming to have killed the very king who spared them. The curse just comes full circle.
And it ultimately rests on Saul's own house. Okay, so that establishes David's spiritual and political credentials. Now let's get into his immediate strategy. The king is dead. David doesn't rush to consolidate power.
No, he acts properly and very publicly. David's response was immediate and multifaceted. First, you have the public expression of genuine grief and strategic political unity.
The famous lament, the bow.
The Song of the Bow. And this lament didn't just mourn Jonathan, who was his true friend, but it also lavishly praised Saul, lauding his bravery, acknowledging his position. This was absolutely crucial.
Why so crucial?
By mourning properly, David demonstrated his sincere regard for Yahweh's leadership over Israel and, politically positioned himself to absorb all of Saul's loyalists.
He understood that respect for the office was paramount, even if the person in it was flawed.
Exactly.
And as soon as the mourning was over, David showed that dependency on God was the true key to his triumphs.
Precisely. When it came time to relocate, he didn't just rush to the largest city. He inquired of God. He asked, "Where should I settle?"
He's admitting he doesn't have all the answers.
Right. He's recognizing that his own human perspective, his charisma, his military power, it all lacked the divine wisdom needed to make the wisest choice. And God directs him specifically to the territory of Judah, his tribal homeland, and the ancient city of Hebron.
And that one act of asking is cited as the key.
That inquiry right there in 2 Samuel 2.1 is cited as the key to his early triumphs. It's all about obedience and dependence.
But right there, the very next verse, 2.2, there's this subtle textual nugget that foreshadows the source of his future tragedy.
And that tragedy, as the source material really insists, lies in his relationships with women. Even as he is crowned king by his own tribe of Judah, David takes on multiple wives. Ahinoam and Abigail are mentioned, among others.
Now, polygamy was culturally accepted then, right?
It was, but it was also explicitly forbidden for Israel's future kings in Deuteronomy. This multiplication of wives, and it was often done not for lust, but to cement political alliances and produce multiple heirs, it plants a very real, very tangible seed for the familial chaos that will just consume his life later.
It's a quiet little warning sign, right at the moment of triumph.
A huge warning sign.
So he's in Hebron, anointed by Judah. He immediately focuses on winning over the former loyalists, particularly the men of Jabesh-Gilead.
Yes, and this demonstrates his immediate commitment to peace, unity, and diplomacy rather than just raw vengeance.
He took special, calculated pains to reach out to them.
He had to. Jabesh-Gilead was staunchly loyal to Saul. These were the men who had risked their lives to retrieve and properly bury the bodies of Saul and his sons.
So to gain their crucial support, which was a necessary bridgehead into the North Tank, David employed some masterful diplomacy.
He undertook 4 specific, very calculated steps aimed at seeking peace and establishing unity.
Okay, lay out those 4 steps. This sounds like an ancient Near East diplomatic manual.
It really does. First, he took the initiative. He contacted them. He didn't wait for them to come groveling to him.
Okay, that's smart.
Second, he paid them a sincere compliment, recognizing their bravery in burying Saul and Jonathan.
Flattery, but sincere flattery.
Exactly. Third, he sort of obliquely reminded them that he was now the Lord's anointed king, implying their continued loyalty to the dead king was now a political liability.
A gentle warning.
A very gentle warning. And finally, he offered a treaty of friendship, assuring them of his favor and his protection. This wasn't just a nice gesture, it was the work of a sophisticated political operator.
Laying the groundwork for a unified nation.
Yes.
But this desire for unity is immediately challenged by the emergence of the North-South divide. David wants peace, but Abner, Saul's former commander, he unilaterally forces a civil war.
Abner's action is a classic example of human ambition just overriding divine will. David was God's anointed successor, but Abner placed personal preference and cultural precedent.
The desire to keep the throne within Saul's house.
Right, he put that over God's revealed will. He unilaterally crowned Saul's remaining son Ishbosheth over the northern tribes. He installed his own puppet, guaranteeing conflict between the south, which was Judah, and the north, Israel.
That brings us to the confrontation at Gibeon, which began almost like an organized sports event, but spiraled into outright hostility.
It was meant to be a proxy war, a kind of ancient gladiatorial contest where 12 men from each side fought. It was supposed to settle the matter quickly.
But it ended in a draw.
A bloody draw, with all 24 men killing each other simultaneously. That immediately forced the battle to escalate into a general engagement. And the sources show us how these conflicts escalate.
They stopped talking, they started fighting.
And then personal hostility took over. Joab's brother, Asahel, pursued Abner relentlessly, driven by pride or ambition. Abner, insisting on defending himself, killed him, and that cemented a personal blood feud between Joab and Abner.
And what's interesting here is the insight that David played no direct part in this escalation.
No, not directly, even though the conflict was technically for his throne. That's the key insight. David stayed apart from the personal hostilities, the blood feuds, the petty squabbles, yet the Lord was working through all that violence and infighting
Between Joab, Abner, and Ishbosheth.
to ultimately place his anointed on the throne of all Israel. David's rule grew stronger and stronger while the northern monarchy just weakened and disintegrated.
And Abner eventually tries to defect to David, recognizing the inevitable. But Joab, fueled by revenge for Asahel, brutally murders him.
He does.
And David condemns the murder, but he fails to punish Joab.
And we see that inconsistency start to bubble up here. The source material notes that David was characteristically too slow to discipline members of his own family or close advisors when they deserved it.
This failure to act decisively against Joab, who was his own nephew, is the first major example of this flaw.
It is. David is managing the affairs of his government properly, condemning the act, mourning Abner, but he's failing catastrophically in the sphere of discipline. And this is the flaw that will plague him throughout his life with Joab, with Amnon, and with Absalom.
That sets the stage for Chapter 5, the true consolidation of power, where David secures his capital and proves his sovereignty.
Yes, he receives his third and final anointing around 1004 BC. And this anointing over all 12 tribes acknowledged his military prowess. He was a proven general. But the text ensures we understand the primacy of the second reason.
God's sovereign choice of him to shepherd Israel.
Exactly. He was recognized both as a military leader and as the divine choice.
And his choice of Jerusalem as the capital was, geographically and politically brilliant. Why was Jerusalem so effective?
It solved the north-south problem instantly. It stood strategically on the border between the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, ensuring both major power bases felt they had an equal claim to the seat of government.
And it was defensible.
Incredibly easy to defend, elevated, surrounded by valleys, which is why the native Jebusites were so arrogant. They boasted that even their blind and lame defenders could defeat any attacker.
A boast that didn't last long, thanks again to Joab.
Joab, always effective in combat, found the vulnerability. The vertical water shaft, this secret passage that connected the city to its underground water supply. By attacking through there, he captured the city, earning him the perpetual honor of being David's general. And Jerusalem was then renamed City of David, or Zion.
When you look at the political and military strategy, it's all brilliant. But what does the source material identify as the absolute, non-negotiable key to David's success?
It's not David's charisma. It's not Joab's ruthlessness. 2 Samuel 5.10 makes it explicit. The Lord helped David wherever he went.
Simple as that.
David prospered because he related to God properly. He acknowledged Yahweh as Israel's real ultimate sovereign, and this contrasts so sharply with Saul, who always saw himself as the ultimate authority. David's willingness to submit was the foundation of his flourishing reign.
Okay, so David is now king in Zion, the city of David. His first major project is to make Jerusalem the religious capital as well, by bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city.
The physical symbol of God's presence.
Right, but this initial attempt is a famous disaster.
David's motive was noble, truly. He wanted to dedicate Jerusalem as the center of worship. But his attempt in chapter 6 was flawed from the start. He chose to use customary practice, transporting the ark on a cart, pulled by oxen, instead of adhering strictly to the Mosaic law.
And those laws, though ancient, were clear about the handling of something so sacred.
They were absolutely non-negotiable. The law in Exodus and Numbers was explicit. The Levites, the priests, were to carry the ark on poles. No one was to touch it.
So when the oxen stumbled and Uzzah reached out,
acting out of good intentions to stop the ark from falling, he died instantly.
This incident is difficult for modern sensibilities. Why such an immediate, drastic punishment for seemingly good intentions?
It illustrates a profound spiritual principle. God's work must be done in God's way to secure God's blessing. Uzzah's act, though well-meaning, was an act of presumption.
Privilege became presumption.
Exactly. David allowed the joy of having the ark close to become presumption, forgetting that God's holiness demands respect and obedience to the rule he sets. Coming close with the best of motives is not enough if you ignore the designated method.
And here's where it gets really interesting, the turning point in David's approach. He pauses. He leaves the ark in the house of Obed-Edom, and he goes home to study.
David's fear and anger initially make him stop the whole process, but then he observes that Obed-Edom's house is greatly blessed because the ark resided there for 3 months.
That sight changes things.
It makes him even more eager, but now with a corrected understanding rooted in obedience. He evidently went and studied the regulations in detail, as 1 Chronicles records. His subsequent successful attempt was marked by the king humbling himself, following the law precisely, and leading with unrestrained joy.
That unrestrained joy leads immediately to his next personal and familial problem.
Yeah.
The rift with his wife, Michal.
David's celebration was public, physical, profoundly enthusiastic dancing and leaping in a linen ephod, placing the honor of Yahweh above his own kingly dignity.
And Michal, Saul's daughter, she watched from a window and scorned him.
She viewed his worship as foolishness, a lack of royal decorum. And the source material intentionally connects her attitude back to her father, Saul. She lacked the spiritual perception to understand that humbling oneself before God is the truest mark of royalty.
And the consequence for Michal was incredibly severe, linking back to that theme of fruitfulness and discipline.
She suffered barrenness for the rest of her life. It's a powerful, symbolic consequence. The text suggests she sowed shun, scorn, and rejection of true worship, and she reaped shun, the opposite of fertility and fruitfulness.
But here is the critical personal failure for David.
Right. Confronted with this spiritual and personal breach in his family, he failed to heal it. He pushed Michal away and allowed the wound to fester. It's another example of him avoiding necessary emotional and relational discipline in his home.
Once the ark is secured, David turns his attention to a grander project, building God a permanent temple.
He feels it's inappropriate for him, the earthly king, to live in a magnificent palace while his true commander-in-chief, God, resides in a temporary tent.
A noble desire.
A very noble desire, driven by a wish to honor and stabilize the nation's worship. But God rejected his suggestion, and he detailed 3 specific, compelling reasons.
What were they?
First, there was no pressing need. The ark had resided contentedly in tents since the Exodus. Second, God had never commanded a permanent temple. It wasn't part of his original plan.
And the third reason was intensely personal to David's career and character.
It was. God deemed David inappropriate for the construction project because he had shed too much blood and was ritually unclean from the long, violent duration of his reign. His son, Solomon, was destined for the job because his reign would be one of peace.
And this offers us a really invaluable lesson.
For you and for me, yes. God sometimes prevents us from carrying out what seems like a noble, desirable project because he wants us to serve him in other designated ways, often paving the way for the next generation.
But God doesn't just issue a bureaucratic rejection. In response to David's heartfelt desire to honor him, God flicks the script.
He does, and he issues the unconditional, everlasting Davidic Covenant. This is the centerpiece of David's reign. God promises to honor David with an everlasting dynasty that secures his line forever.
The promises are unconditional.
And foundational to biblical prophecy. We can outline 4 main commitments. First, David will receive a great name, a famous and everlasting reputation.
Okay.
Second, a permanent homeland for Israel. Third, undisturbed rest from all enemies. And fourth, the monumental promise, an everlasting royal dynasty and kingdom for David's heirs.
An everlasting kingdom that finds its political fulfillment in Solomon, but its ultimate divine fulfillment in Jesus Christ.
Precisely. This covenant means that while David's descendants suffered interruptions, exile, conquest, the privilege of ruling over Israel as the anointed king would always belong to David's line. It channels God's sovereignty through this specific family.
That brings up a fascinating technical nugget that the source material unpacks. Why Saul, a Benjamite, was chosen first when Jacob's prophecy decreed the king must come from Judah.
Okay, so let's slow down and unpack this because it's an ancient legal and theological puzzle. Jacob's prophecy was clear. The king would come from Judah. So why Saul?
Right.
The answer lies deep in the lineage of Judah, introducing what scholars call the illegitimacy clause. Judah's royal line descended through Perez.
Perez, the son of the complicated incident with Tamar.
Correct. Perez was an illegitimate son in the context of the law. And Deuteronomy 23.2 stated a severe restriction. An illegitimate son could not enter the congregation of the Lord, which basically meant they couldn't hold the highest offices of authority until the 10th generation.
So David's family was under an ancient legal prohibition because of an ancestor centuries prior?
Exactly. Jesse, David's father, was the 9th generation descendant of Perez. David was the 10th.
So when the people first demanded a king,
David was technically still legally disqualified. God chose Saul as a temporary placeholder, a kind of necessary stopgap, until David could come of age, meaning until the 10th generation had passed.
wow. It's an incredible testament to divine timing and precision.
It preserved the line of identification and ensured God's original prophetic word was not broken.
So in response to receiving this earth-shattering, everlasting covenant, David's prayer of thanksgiving is an absolute model of humility.
It's a stunning display of submission, contrasting so sharply with the arrogance that defined Saul's failure. In his prayer, David repeatedly referred to himself 10 times as Yahweh's servant and called God his master 8 times.
He accepted that he was a vassal king.
He had to defer to a higher authority. Saul clung to his kingly prerogative and lost the kingdom. David, concerned more about honoring the Lord than guarding his own reputation, had his kingdom secured forever.
That sense of alignment is affirmed in chapter 8, where David provides security and justice, and we see that recurring theme of success once again.
The mantra of David's early reign. The Lord helped David wherever he went. God established his righteousness through David only after David had properly aligned his priorities.
Relocating the capital, bringing the ark to Jerusalem according to the law, and receiving the covenant.
It's the recipe for blessing, right relationship leading to practical prosperity.
And what was the geographic scope of this unified kingdom?
It stretched from the Gulf of Aqaba in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. This was truly the peak of ancient Israelite power. But it's crucial to note that much of this territory was tribute-paying vassal states, not permanent, fully possessed land.
So not the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic land promise.
Not yet. But David's military successes established Israel as the dominant regional power, and he organized a cabinet to govern it.
And that unique detail about his sons. David's sons were priests. What exactly does that mean?
Since they weren't Levites, they weren't performing sacrifices. This position meant they were functioning in a mediatory, non-Levitical, sacerdotal capacity.
Essentially as chief ministers or representatives of the king.
Right. Acting as liaisons between the king and the people in matters of divine law and state justice. It demonstrates that unique combination of political and spiritual authority David possessed.
Okay, so we transition now from these monumental triumphs of David's government to the internal decay that will ultimately define his later years.
And the section starts with a stunning picture of grace that serves as a high-water mark before the fall.
Chapter 9.
It's a necessary thematic pause, a powerful picture of grace. David sought out Mephibosheth, Jonathan's crippled son. He found him hiding in Lodabar, a barren place. Mephibosheth was lame, fearful of the king, living in poverty.
And David showed him he's a loyal love or unearned grace.
For Jonathan's sake, David sought him out, brought him into his house, restored all the land that belonged to Saul's family, and crucially commanded that Mephibosheth eat at the king's table for the rest of his life.
Adopting him as his own son.
This highlights David's strength. He was a covenant-keeping king who understood the nature of loyal, unearned grace. This is David at his absolute best.
And this moment of perfect covenant keeping immediately precedes the context for David's massive, fatal mistake in chapter 11.
The Ammonite War in chapter 10 provides the historical context. David's power is growing. He's surrounded by peace and prosperity. The source material hints that David's growing power has led to arrogance.
He's no longer the humble shepherd. He's a comfortable, established monarch.
Right, and he stops being sensitive to God's leadership and starts letting his passions dictate his decisions.
And the greatest mistake of his life, the genesis of his adultery with Bathsheba, is set up immediately by the writer pointing out David's withdrawal from responsibility.
The passage opens with a critical detail. In the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, David remained at Jerusalem.
That detail is not incidental.
Not at all. Kings were expected to lead their armies. David was residing in luxury while Joab was doing the hard work besieging Rabbah. The implication is undeniable. When David withdrew from his primary kingly responsibilities, he gave the enemy temptation and idleness an enormous opportunity.
And the temptation follows that insidious age-old sequence.
He saw, he desired, he took. He was walking on his rooftop, saw Bathsheba bathing, and rather than averting his eyes, he indulged the desire. He sent for her. David, who was content to be given the kingdom by God, now seized with violence and power the woman of his desire.
He abused his royal authority to collect Bathsheba.
Yes.
There's a profound counter-jargon nugget here. You would think that a man with a full harem would be satisfied and immune to this temptation.
That is the secular lie that our source material immediately challenges. David had a full harem, yet he desired one more, belonging to his loyal soldier. The passion of lust is not satisfied by a full harem. It is, in fact, increased.
There's a perpetual hunger.
That authority does not satisfy. It merely enables. David had gone from being a shepherd king to an entitled dictator who believed his desires trumped the loyalty he owed to his own soldiers.
The compounding of this initial sin spirals into something far darker: murder. and the unmasking of his hypocrisy.
He attempted 3 cover-ups, each one escalating in desperation. His goal was simple: cover up the resulting pregnancy to avoid public scandal.
First, the clean cover-up.
Asking Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, to return home and sleep with his wife, thus legitimizing the child. When Uriah, a man of profound integrity, refused out of solidarity with his comrades, David tried the dirty cover-up, getting Uriah drunk.
And when Uriah still refused,
David resorted to the criminal cover-up, sending Uriah back to the front lines carrying his own death warrant to Joab.
instructing Joab to place Uriah in the thickest part of the fighting and then retreat.
He was ultimately responsible not just for Uriah's death, but the death of several innocent soldiers caught in that tactical failure. And the source material elevates the character of Uriah the Hittite to just expose David's moral decay.
Uriah, a foreigner, a Hittite,
Was a dedicated believer and one of David's mighty men. His refusal to enjoy the comforts of home while the ark and his comrades were in the field just underscores David's profound lack of integrity. Uriah demonstrated more commitment to David's principles than the king himself.
David lives this lie for months until Nathan the prophet confronts him, using the parable of the rich man who stole the poor man's only lamb.
The parable was perfectly constructed to appeal to David's deeply ingrained compassion as a shepherd, and David's response was immediate and violently hypocritical. He ordered the rich man to make 4-fold restitution.
And that very pronouncement
Was used by God for divine fulfillment. 4 of David's sons later died as a result of the collapse following this sin. David had unwittingly pronounced judgment upon his own house.
This confrontation reveals the critical theological duality in God's response, the difference between forgiveness and consequences.
This is perhaps the most critical takeaway from the whole narrative. David confessed his sin sincerely, and God, in his astonishing grace, removed the guilt of the sin. David was saved from eternal damnation.
Unlike Saul, who never truly repented.
Right. However, God did not remove the consequences or the temporal discipline.
Can we put that in simple terms for the listener? What does retaining the consequences actually mean?
Think of it this way. When you confess to God, the spiritual record of the sin is erased. The guilt is gone. But if you were driving drunk, got forgiven but still crashed your car, forgiveness doesn't make the physical damage to the bumper disappear.
Or make the legal fines vanish.
Exactly. God forgave David, but David still had to live with the physical wreckage of his actions. And his punishment, fulfilling the principle that what we sow we will eventually reap, would involve his own fertility and children becoming the source of his discipline.
And the specific judgment mirrored David's crime with unnerving precision and publicity.
It was tailor-made. David's voyeurism on the rooftop, his private sin, was directly mirrored by Nathan's curse that David's wives would be taken publicly.
Which was later physically fulfilled by Absalom's infamous rooftop orgy.
Yes. Furthermore, the first child conceived with Bathsheba died, ensuring that David could not profit from his sin. He could not enrich his line through an act of murder and adultery.
This sin sets off the harvest of familial dysfunction in chapter 13, spiraling rapidly, starting with the rake of Tamar.
Amnon, David's firstborn son and crown prince, developed a selfish, consuming infatuation with his half-sister Tamar. The incident was facilitated by Jonadab, a crafty man, reflecting how sin often requires a calculated helper.
And Amnon's attraction was so extreme
That the source material notes his desire instantly turned to fierce hatred immediately after he'd satisfied himself. Tamar was left desolate, unmarried, and childless, which was effectively a living death in that society.
And what does David do in response to this horror? He reverts to his newly learned passive failure mode.
David took absolutely no action against Amnon, who deserved death under Mosaic law for his crime. Perhaps David feared appearing hypocritical, but this was David withdrawing from his responsibilities yet again.
And by failing to execute swift, necessary discipline on the crown prince.
He gave the enemy another opportunity to further ruin his family through unrestrained passions and cycles of violence.
And the most dramatic consequence of that passivity is Absalom's cold, patient revenge.
Which mirrors David's murder of Uriah. 2 years later, Absalom, Tamar's full brother, executed Amnon. Absalom's patience and calculation are breathtaking. This confirms that Galatians 6.7 principle. David's sons were chips off the old block, demonstrating the same ruthlessness and violence as their father.
And Absalom saw this not just as revenge, but as an opportunity.
An opportunity to remove the heir apparent and advance his own candidacy for the throne.
So in this moment, the 6 visible consequences of David's initial sin has surfaced and are now active agents of destruction in his house.
Yes, we can trace the wreckage. The first child died. Amnon raped Tamar. Communication broke down entirely between the brothers. Amnon was murdered. Absalom was exiled for 3 years, and David had become an even more passive, emotionally paralyzed father, unable to govern his home.
He succeeded at work, failed at home.
That's it. And the theological lesson, once again, is harsh but clear. Confession and forgiveness do not stop the harvest.
The harvest continues.
Grace means God, in forgiving you, gives you the strength to endure the consequences you created. David was forgiven, but the dysfunction persisted. This is why the source material emphasizes preventative theology, rather than relying solely on corrective theology after the fact.
So the family breakdown, fueled by David's passivity, leads inevitably to the political crisis of Absalom's rebellion. David wants his exiled son back, but his solution is a deep compromise.
A compromise that only brews further resentment. Joab, always the pragmatic operator, senses David's underlying love for his son and schemes to bring Absalom back.
Right, using the wise woman of Tekoa.
David conceded, allowing Absalom to return to Jerusalem, but critically refused him personal fellowship or trust for 2 years.
This was the unbearable compromise. It was an official pardon, but a personal rejection.
That's exactly right. And that lack of genuine reconciliation bred immense poisonous resentment in Absalom. He regarded himself as a prisoner king. David was reluctant to fully pardon him because Absalom had not truly repented, but this halfway measure just intensified Absalom's desire to seize the throne.
That resentment became the basis for Absalom's 4-year political coup.
He spent 4 years subtly and strategically undermining confidence in David's rule. He was driven by ambition, running contrary to God's will.
And he used classic political maneuvering.
Criticizing his father's slow judicial administration, promising the people he would rule better and faster, and leveraging his incredible personal charm and strong physical attractiveness, particularly his famously thick hair, to win over public sentiment.
When the coup breaks, David is forced into a strategic retreat from Jerusalem.
Fleeing to save his own life and spare the capital, and this flight highlights a critical loyalty contrast. It's a remarkable study in devotion and hypocrisy. David was deserted by his own son, yet the foreign mercenaries, the Cherethites, Pelethites, and Ittai from Gath remained absolutely loyal to him.
It shows that David's core integrity, his hesed, it won the friendship of outsiders even when his own kin turned traitor.
It did. And when David receives the news that his trusted counselor Ahithophel has defected, his immediate response is pure, dependent leadership.
He went straight to prayer.
Make the advice of Ahithophel foolish, O Lord. And Ahithophel, the source material suggests, was very likely Bathsheba's grandfather.
So his defection wasn't just political opportunism.
It was deeply personal, ancient Near Eastern revenge for the murder of his grandson-in-law Uriah and the death of his great-grandchild.
And Ahithophel immediately advises Absalom on how to secure power, and in doing so, simultaneously fulfills Nathan's curse.
Ahithophel's advice was absolutely brilliant and chillingly pragmatic. Publicly lie with David's 10 concubines on the rooftop. In the ancient East, the appropriation of a king's harem immediately signaled the undeniable permanent transfer of power.
It was a massive insult to David and brought about the specific judgment God had predicted.
The public shame mirroring David's private voyeurism, the king was reaping exactly what he had sown.
But David's prayer, make the advice of Ahithophel foolish, was answered through divine intervention and the loyalty of Hushai.
Hushai, David's loyal informant, successfully deceived Absalom into rejecting Ahithophel's sound advice. Ahithophel had correctly advised immediately pursuing David while he was weak,
But Hushai appealed directly to Absalom's ego.
convincing him to wait, to amass a huge national army to ensure a complete, glorious victory that would make Absalom look even better. This gave David crucial time to cross the Jordan and organize. The Lord had deliberately frustrated the soundest political advice for the sake of his anointed king.
This intervention leads directly to the Judas Iscariot parallel.
Ahithophel, realizing that his best, most politically sound advice was rejected, knew the coup would inevitably fail. He went home, put his affairs in order, and hanged himself. The source material draws a direct comparison to David's future descendant, Jesus, and his own betrayer, Judas Iscariot.
It's a powerful reminder.
That even when former friends betray us, the Lord ultimately preserves and protects those who remain faithful.
The rebellion culminates in Absalom's violent end in the forest of Ephraim, an end David had explicitly tried to prevent.
David, acting as a compassionate father, had instructed his commanders to deal gently with Absalom. But Joab, acting as a ruthless statesman protecting the realm from a traitor, ignored him.
Absalom was caught by his hair in the branches.
A horrifying irony, as the sources suggest the very vanity he prided himself on became his downfall. Joab wounded him, and his men finished the job. And the source material even notes that the forest itself devoured more of Absalom's men than David's soldiers did,
Suggesting Yahweh's active assistance. But Absalom's death exposes the profound, lasting rift in David's leadership. His mourning was excessive and misplaced.
His grief was overwhelming. He wept for the traitor son, repeating, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." He was mourning the man who sought to destroy him, neglecting the soldiers who had risked their lives to save his kingdom.
And Joab, stepping into the role of the necessary disciplinarian, warns him.
He correctly warned David that he must temper his personal sorrow immediately and thank his soldiers, or risk losing their support and stability forever.
Joab essentially told David he was a failure as a king in that moment.
He did. He pointed out David's failure to distinguish between his personal grief and his governmental responsibilities. This excessive grief, following his original failure to discipline Amnon and his later refusal to truly reconcile with Absalom, shows the perpetual failure of David's fatherhood.
So David wisely follows Joab's counsel, returns, and focuses on repairing the schisms that had fractured the kingdom.
David's post-rebellion policy was one of deliberate forgiveness and reunification, replacing retribution. This involved pardoning the men of Judah, forgiving Shimei of Saul's family, and dealing with the complicated situation involving Ziba and Mephibosheth.
Right. David divided Mephibosheth's estate between him and the opportunist servant Ziba, but Mephibosheth's reaction argues strongly for his innocence.
It does. Mephibosheth demonstrated his true loyalty by being perfectly willing to give up the entire estate, stating, "Let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home." David's new approach, extending forgiveness, was a powerful testimony. He had learned from the devastating consequences of his earlier lack of forgiveness.
But the unity was fragile, leading immediately to the final crisis of the Sheba rebellion.
Sheba, a discontented Benjamite, capitalized on the lingering tension, attempting to split the kingdom again. And David's reliance on Joab, despite their strained issues, is again unavoidable.
And Joab, seizing the opportunity, murdered David's newly appointed commander, Amasa.
He kissed the man he was about to slay. The classic kiss of death, another disturbing parallel to Judas before stabbing him. Joab was a brutal, devoted, and necessary agent of David's success, yet constantly operating outside the moral boundaries David himself was supposed to enforce.
Joab then pursued Sheba to the city of Abel of Bethmaachah. And this siege was stopped, not by Joab's military might,
but by the wisdom of a local woman.
The woman's decisive action saved the city, David's reputation, and many innocent lives.
Her wisdom demonstrated a powerful contrast to Joab's reliance on violence. She convinced the city to hand over Sheba's head, proving that often talk solves a problem that war would only have complicated.
David, now firmly back in control, next addresses a historical injustice that was causing a physical crisis in the land. Saul's wrong against the Gibeonites.
And this links directly back to that fertility theme we've been tracking. Saul broke Israel's solemn covenant with the Gibeonites, and God punished the nation with famine, a lack of fertility.
So David, acting as the covenant-keeping king, righted the wrong.
He handed over 7 of Saul's descendants to the Gibeonites, and his faithfulness to the covenant restored fertility to the land, again demonstrating that necessary alignment between a righteous king and national blessing.
The final crisis recorded in 2 Samuel is David's own lapse in faith. The crisis of trust when he ordered the census in chapter 24.
After years of rebellion and warfare, David stopped trusting solely in Yahweh for protection. He began placing his confidence in sheer human numbers and military personnel rather than God's promise.
The census was an act of relying on human strength.
It was, and the writer notes both God and the Satan adversary were involved. God used an adversary to bring judgment on the object of his anger as a consequence of David's pride.
This selfish act resulted in a plague that killed 70,000 men.
It was. Joab, ironically, was the one who questioned the need for it, but David insisted. When the plague hit, David's repentance was immediate and sincere. He confessed his sin and was given a unique choice of punishment.
And he chose to leave the punishment in God's hands.
He stated, "I prefer that we be attacked by the Lord, for his mercy is great. I do not want to be attacked by human hands." He had learned firsthand that God, despite being just, is profoundly merciful.
The plague ceased at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite.
Where the angel of the Lord stopped destroying Jerusalem, And David purchased that site, establishing a lasting legacy that points forward to the future.
He purchased the threshing floor, built an altar, and offered sacrifices.
It was a site where death was averted by sacrifice. And this purchase was the crucial first step in the building of Solomon's temple, established as the perpetual reminder that, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. David showed that the justice of the sword was averted because the ultimate sword of divine justice would eventually find its mark in the Son of God, his greater descendant.
That brings us full circle through the turbulence of this astonishing reign. We have followed David from a cunning political operator and loyal servant of God, unifying Israel and establishing an everlasting covenant, to a king undone by personal passions.
His mistakes created consequences that violently rippled through his entire family and throughout his kingdom. He was the covenant-keeping king who fundamentally failed the most basic covenant of family.
The central, unavoidable lesson of David's life is that he succeeded at work.
But he failed spectacularly at home. He was characteristically too slow to discipline members of his own family when they deserved it. This lack of decisive action plagued him, leading to perpetual familial disaster involving Joab, Amnon, and Absalom.
This draws a strong, critical parallel to contemporary leadership, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The source material suggests a strong, critical lesson for all leaders. The home, not one's work or one's public achievements, is the true proving ground for leadership.
As later foundational biblical writings suggest, if a man cannot manage his own household, how could he possibly manage the affairs of God's house?
Or indeed the affairs of any larger organization. David proved you can write psalms, build a kingdom, and secure a dynasty, but still destroy your life and family through passive fatherhood.
A deeply insightful and frankly terrifying distinction.
Indeed, it forces us to look inward.
Considering David's ability to secure the kingdom and write inspired scripture versus his repeated failure to act decisively within his own household, if David's greatest son, Jesus Christ, is the ultimate anointed one, the one who will return to reign and execute perfect justice, what might that imply about the severity of divine judgment awaiting those who, like David, know the truth and possess the tools for righteous living, but continually fail to manage the household God has entrusted them with?
It's a profound question of accountability that echoes through every generation.